Rachel Reeves found herself on the Inquisitor's chair with Nick Robinson this morning on the Today programme, and once again it was thumbscrew time for Miss Reeves.
Well, of course it's welcome that inflation has returned to target for the first time in nearly 3 years, but unlike Conservative ministers, I'm not going to claim that everything is all fine.
Gets good news, decides to moan about something else.
That the cost of living crisis is over, because I know that pressures on family finances are still acute, because while inflation is down, of course, those higher prices still remain.
So the cost of prices is in fact prices. Right. OK, I'm with you.
The cost of the energy bills, or indeed people who are looking to remortgage this year or have seen their rents increase, those, of course, have gone up sharply since the Conservatives' mini-budget. So welcome news that inflation is back at target. But the choice really at this election is whether you want to just carry on as we are with the chaos and decline we've seen in the economy, or to turn a corner with Labour with a credible and a comprehensive plan for economic growth.
Labour aren't unique in having a manifesto with a number of black holes in it. They have undertaken not to increase income tax, VAT or national insurance. But when it comes to council tax, for instance, they remain silent. Some of their representatives have been quizzed in the media about whether there will be rises in council tax, and the result has been pretty much...
Tra-la-la, I can't hear you, tra-la-la, I can't hear you, tra-la-la.
The problem is that we've been running a two-party system for so long, we've forgotten what it's like to have an alternative to it. Proportional representation will be a great device, but neither of the main parties seem inclined to actually incorporate it into the voting system. But anyway, back to Rachel Reeves.
Why, if you are promising change, not carry on as we are, is the Labour Party promising to increase NHS spending less than George Osborne did in the years of austerity?
Well, we've set out the first steps that we would take on the National Health Service, 40,000 additional appointments every single week to clear the backlog of 7.5 million people on NHS waiting lists.
Yes, but the big question is how? Because there's not enough staff. If you're going to train people up, that's going to take a couple of years to actually come to fruition. So the idea of actually having more appointments for people to get to is dependent on the fact that there'll actually be people there to see them.
700,000 emergency dental appointments every year, because we know that access to dentists is a real scandal today.
Again, dentistry is a mixed bag. It's a skill that takes a lot of training. Figures from the British Dental Association last year showed nearly 60% of dentists in England were looking to reduce their NHS commitments, mainly due to payments and the lack of support that they get. The other issue is a good proportion of NHS dentistry in this country is undertaken on a goodwill basis by people who have some sort of altruistic attitude towards their community. Most of the UK's NHS dentists are independent businesses and not employed by the health service directly. The costs incurred for the NHS patients isn't covered by the funding they receive. So, for instance, if a patient needs 1 filling or 10, a dentist gets the same amount regardless of their expenses. It's much more financially viable from a business perspective and a long-term view for dental surgery to cover its costs with private patients rather than accepting patients referred to it by the NHS.
And investment in new scanners and new equipment in hospitals to help clear those backlogs.
You need radiographers to operate this equipment. You need trained staff, and there just isn't the well of qualified people around to actually fill these vacancies. It's all very well spending money on flashy new equipment and state-of-the-art kit, but if you haven't got anyone to actually operate it or look at the results, then you might as well just throw the money down the drain.
So we are proposing additional spending in the NHS, and we will fund that by ensuring that non-DOMs pay their fair share of tax in Britain. If you make your home in Britain, you should pay your taxes here, and under Labour you will, as well as cracking down on tax avoidance, which the National Audit Office say can bring in £5 billion a year.
Tax avoidance is a very good thing to go after, but also tax evasion. There's a lot of people not paying their tax, and a lot of corporations are getting away with paying very, very little indeed. Those are the sort of areas that need tightening up, but unfortunately under the Conservative government we've lost so many experienced tax officers that we're going to have to recruit and train people up, and again this is going to take a long time to do.
If we make the investments that are needed in HMRC.
I hear you. I think our listeners will hear you talk about first steps. Can we just get to the fact, though, that I raised with you? Labour is proposing an increase in health spending of 1.1% in real terms. That's what's in your manifesto. More than inflation, but not much more. During the years of austerity, under George Osborne as Chancellor, the budget of the NHS went up by 1.4%. So I ask you again, why promise change while promising to increase NHS spending less than George Osborne.
Now, this should be interesting because she's got to answer the question and appear not to be going back to the age of austerity that the Tories brought in. The Labour manifesto is all very well, but there's plenty of pictures of Keir Starmer there used as filler. I think about 18 of them out of the 132 or so pages. And there is one or two areas which you've got to look at and say, how are you going to do that? And that isn't thought through properly at all. But that's true of all the parties. The fact that in many ways Starmer's Labour are going to be even worse than the Conservatives when they first came to office is a prediction which should shake the knees of any right-minded person.
So what we need to do to sustainably invest in our public services is to grow the economy. And that's why what we're seeking at this election is a mandate for growth.
Now, with respect here, any party is going to promise growth and security and all the other things that go along with a healthy economy. Nobody's going to sit there and say, please vote for us, we're entirely going to it up.
That's why our manifesto is so focused. Now, I recognise that an immediate injection of cash is necessary in our National Health Service. That is essential, and that's why we've set that out through those measures I've described.
Yeah,
but
it's a figure described by Paul Johnson at the Institute of Fiscal Studies as, quotes, tiny. He then goes on to go further and says, trivial. So let me just get this clear from you, if I can. Are you saying that you will spend more on the NHS? You want to spend more? You want to spend faster if you can? This is merely what you're saying for now is what you do instantly on coming to office?
If we can grow the economy, which I know we can, and I'm determined to
do... Then
why
put an if there? Why put an if? You're so convinced that you can actually manage to do what you're promising to do. Why put an if there? That just says, I definitely will be able to do that. But just in case it doesn't work, here, have an orange.
Then we will be able to improve living standards whilst also having money for our public services.
I don't think you could actually make living standards worse unless you force people to live as subterranean moles.
But we have to deliver that growth before we start spending any money that can be brought in. I'm really clear that there's nothing in our manifesto that is not fully costed and fully funded. That's a basic principle for me, that I'm not going to spend money that we don't have or that hasn't come in yet. But to grow the economy means being able to improve living standards, which this is the first parliament ever where living standards are lower at the end than they were at the beginning.
Yeah, but that's to do with insecure work, poverty wages, and it wasn't helped by the Labour Party voting for some of the cruel and pernicious benefit and welfare changes that the Tories proposed. Labour's hand isn't clean in any of this. In fact, it's up to the elbows in filth, whereas the Conservatives are just they're buried in it.
What you know is, though, that if you have new demands that go beyond what's in your manifesto, let me just suggest a few. Settling the junior doctors' pay dispute, settling the dispute with GPs about their contract, dealing with mental health, and that is just in the National Health Service, you will have to spend more, much more than you are currently spending, and you'll have to do it almost the second you walk into Downing Street, if you do. So it's fair to suggest that you might have to look at tax to do that. Now, when you're a backbencher, you called for increases in capital gains tax, you called for a reform in inheritance tax, you called for a cut to pensions tax relief, in other words, paying more tax on your pension. Do you really want voters to believe you don't believe any of those things anymore on the eve of a general election?
Well, what's happened since then, and that was many years ago now, is that the economy has stagnated, living standards have declined, and so that's why the number one mission of an incoming Labour government is to grow the economy.
Again, with respect, the number one mission of any incoming government is to grow an economy. That's what they're there for. That's what they're charged with. That's exactly, literally what they're supposed to do.
Because the way out of this is not more taxes or tinkering with tax rates. It is a wholesale reform of how our economy works to encourage businesses to invest in Britain, to create jobs in Britain.
It's not tinkering to pay the bills, Rachel Reeves. You have to pay the bills. And I gave you a list of things that you haven't found a way to pay for. Junior doctors' pay, GP's contract, mental health. Where does that money come from in 3 months' time?
Nick, we have to grow the economy.
Again, she uses the catch-all line, we've got to grow the economy. I'm really enjoying this, actually. It's really beneficial for me because it means that I can actually grow my rhubarb without having to spend out on fertiliser.
You're not going to grow it by 3 months' time. This is nonsense. You know that's nonsense.
Nick, we've set out the limited tax changes that we will make on non-doms and tax avoidance, on private equity, on business rates and VAT, on private school fees, and asking the energy giants to pay their fair share of tax with an extended windfall tax. We will use that money for that immediate injection of cash, which I know is needed into our public services.
Which is less than George Osborne spent during the years of austerity.
But then we have to grow our economy. And if we can grow our economy, we will be able to make different choices. Because the truth is we've got into this doom loop in the UK of low growth and high taxes. And it's not good for anyone. It's not working. If our economy had just grown at the average rate of similar industrialised OECD economies these last 14 years, our economy today would be £150 billion bigger.
Sure, but we're talking about now and not then. And the decisions you will face now and not then.
Yes, but Nick, the point is, if we grew our economy, we were about to improve living standards and have money for public services.
Yeah, you're on about growth and public services, but it's going to take time to get growth, so public services are going to continue to deteriorate. There's no money left. At least that's what they tell you. But governments can print their own money. It's virtually a bottomless pit if they want to. And it's a big if in this case.
You haven't ruled out increasing the taxes that you said you believed in increasing when you were a backbencher. You haven't ruled out an increase in capital gains tax. You used to believe it was a good idea. You haven't ruled out an increase in inheritance tax.
We don't need to increase any of those taxes.
Don't need to, but you're not ruling it out.
Well, I'm not going to write 5 years' worth of budgets before we've even won a general election.
So voters are entitled to conclude you might do what you believed in a few years ago and put them all up.
We don't need to do those things.
And there we go again. It's a typical politician trick. She's saying they don't need to do those things, but she won't categorically confirm that they won't do them.
So what we're seeking at this election is a mandate to grow the economy, not a mandate to tinker around with tax rates. That's not what I'm about. I'm about growing the economy.
So where does the money for paying the junior doctors more come from then?
We're going to have to live within the envelope.
I don't know about you, but I would prefer a sort of more sturdy structure like a house or a bungalow or something like that. An envelope seems kind of cramped.
But we have that immediate injection of cash into our frontline public services.
I don't know where this money comes from to paying doctors more. What about teachers? Currently, there is a threat from the National Education Union to go on strike. Are you going to say to teachers, you can have one teacher per every 3 schools? That's what the promise in your manifesto amounts to. 1 in every 3 schools over 5 years. But you can't have a pay rise because we haven't got any money because we haven't grown the economy.
And again, this comes back to the salient point I made a little bit while ago. Teachers don't just grow on trees. They're not just people hanging around in betting shops and newsagents. You know, teachers are saying, I wish I could get a job in education. There's a reason why it takes years to become a teacher or a doctor or a lawyer or any of those professions, and that is because you need training, you need qualifications, you need motivation, and you need to be respected once you're doing the actual job. None of these things have been undertaken in the last 14 years. We have a shortage of these people, and those people who are qualifying are taking a look at the working conditions in Great Britain and thinking, well, no, stuff that, I'm off to Australia or America or Germany or wherever. They're having a better work-life balance, they're paid well, and they're respected.
I recognise we're not going to be able to do everything we want to do straight away, but that's why we're going to get going on this plan for growth. And don't just take my word for it, Nick. Take the word of the 120 business leaders who signed a letter endorsing Labour's plans for growth at the beginning of this election campaign. Take the word of John Cordwell, one of the biggest donors to the Conservatives at the last general election, one of our country's most successful entrepreneurs and businessmen, who yesterday said that he'll be backing Labour for the first time in his life at this election because he recognises that it's only Keir Starmer and the Labour Party that have a plan for turning around our economy. We're determined to do that. That's why we're setting out the stability that we need to give businesses the confidence to invest with confidence, the reform we need with the reforms to the planning system and the skills system, and the investment with our new National Wealth Fund to invest alongside with business in the jobs and industries of the future.
And you don't want another. I'm perfectly happy to talk about growth. I've got questions here to ask you about growth, but I ask you about spending warnings from independent economists. You don't want to talk about them.
But the two are linked.
I ask you about taxes. You don't want to talk about them. Let me do one last one on tax before we get to growth.
Nick, the two things are linked.
Long term, not short term now.
In the end, the only way that we'll have the money for our public services is if we grow the economy.
Long term.
It's not
what do you do next month, next autumn, next winter, next year?
We can get cracking on these things straight away.
And there you have it. There wasn't much more in the interview of any consequence, really. It was the usual pre-election ramble about growth and promises and we'll do this and we'll do that. But when you actually drill down into it, there's a lot of holes in that manifesto. There's a lot of holes in all the manifestos. And it's just a question of finding which is the shallowest one that's going to do the least damage to your undercarriage. I'm sorry for the metaphor.